Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Thursday, January 16th, 2025, an important day in my life and my family's life. This is my father's 95th birthday. Happy birthday to Norman Podhoretz on his 95th birthday. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary. With me, as always, executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Social commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John.
And joining us today, co-author of The Genius of Israel and Startup Nation, and the host of the indispensable Call Me Back podcast, indispensable for anybody who wants to know what is going on in Israel with the war between Israel and Hamas, and therefore a unique presence today, given the ceasefire, our friend Dan Senor. Hi, Dan.
Hey, John. How are you?
Good. All right. So before we get to that, we're just going to spend 2 minutes on the worst Oval Office speech of my lifetime. I believe I'm trying very hard to think, as a former presidential speechwriter myself, and therefore somebody who has a kind of, historical vested interest, having seen almost every presidential speech of any major note since 1976, and thinking back, there have been Oval Office speeches like fireside speech, whatever, like the Malaise speech that Carter gave in 1979 that have had very deleterious consequences, or like backfired, or something like that. Bill Clinton saying that, paying taxes is something we called patriotism, which was his first major speech in 1993, did not serve him well. For example, paying higher taxes is a form of patriotism. But I think as a piece of rhetoric, this was a bizarre, the first half was written by an AI, and the second half was written by Flora Lewis and Al Newhart in the 1970s. Like, the worst kind of, what's wrong with our country? It's this thing called artificial intelligence. And social media aren't doing fact checking. But it was 17 minutes that puts paid on this administration, in the sense that I believe that this is the last that we are going to hear from Joe Biden. I mean, maybe once a year somebody will go and interview him in Wilmington or something and have him say, "Oh, it created 17 million jobs," or whatever. But this was, ice flow. He Monday at 12:01, that guy is gone from American public life. His wife is gone from American public life. This presidency will go down the memory hole, and that will be the end of him. This is where
it's already like he reminds me of, like when a show, those shows that are on the air that you didn't realize they're still on the air. You go, oh my God, that's still. I thought that ended. I thought it was just like in reruns. That's the Biden vibe now.
But the speech itself was a perfect example of a lack of awareness about what the Democratic Party is now. I mean, the fact that this guy, who has enriched himself and his family for decades in Washington, D.C., and who just gave, freedom medals to several questionable billionaires, is railing about an oligarchs and oligopoly, and the social media stuff is obviously hilarious. But I think you have to see his speech as a bookend with Jill Biden's Washington Post interview, because both of them are quite bitter.
This interview appeared yesterday morning in the Washington Post,
and she was score settling, particularly with Nancy Pelosi and others. But I think that that tone of bitterness is something you see throughout a lot of the Democratic Party right now. You saw it, and you've started to see it in the senators who are doing their advise and consent process with some of the nominees. They haven't quite come to grips with what just happened to their party, and you really saw that thrown into high relief with Biden's somewhat also kind of sadly slurring remarks in the Oval Office.
Dan, quickly before we get to Israel, can I? Go ahead.
No, that word that you just said, Christine, sadly, that's at this point I'm in the sad phase. I just feel this whole thing is sad. I don't mean, and people say, "Oh, I feel sad," is like what they really mean is, it's actually sad. I mean sad. Like it's a pathetic situation. And all I think about whenever I watch the speech, or he honestly thought he tried to run for president again. We would be right now. Like he actually believed we should have 4 more years of this would be at his best. It would be deteriorating from here. And I mean, I know the whole thing came collapsing and the Democratic leadership and the establishment drove him out, but like there was a moment where the Democratic establishment and the whole machine was rallying behind him. And but for that debate, I keep thinking about it, but for that debate, had Trump not pushed for and agreed to that early debate, think about what we wouldn't have had a debate until after the nominating.
Then Trump would have won 40 states. 40
I know,
states.
but imagine what
I know.
Yeah. It's just that we could have, that they thought he could be like this and make the case that he should be beginning his second term on Monday.
I just, in the end, he said this thing last week where someone asked him in one of these farewell interviews. I guess he's going to give one tonight to Lawrence O'Donnell. That should be uninteresting.
It's going to be a killer.
It's going to be a thrilling confrontation. But he said last week, that he could have won if he'd run,
and Harris.
And Kamala could have won too. So it's like, okay, are you trying to make the case that you're seen like
the triumph of joy?
What
over
year
reality.
is this? Who's the president of the? The questions they ask people when they're old in the hospital. When they come out of whatever, is like, who is the president right now? Right. Could you actually legitimately say that you were the president? I'm not even sure that's true. I wanted to ask you one question, then get to Israel. Pam Bondi, the nominee for Attorney General, who had her confirmation here. There were like 6 confirmation hearings yesterday.
Yeah.
Sean Duffy talked about his children, is very charged at the Department of Education. And then Marco Rubio, had a kind of love fest from what I could tell, mostly with to the extent that I saw it. And Pam Bondi got into it with newly minted Senator Adam Schiff in a way that is like, maybe some of these Trump changes are actually kind of salubrious because I've never seen anything like this. Basically nominees, it's like butter wouldn't melt in their mouths. Somebody says, are you going to do X, Y, and Z? And then she would say, Senator, I'm going to ask my staff to look into that. Yeah. We'll get you answers tomorrow. I just want you to understand that we're all in this together and something like that. So Adam Schiff says to her, are you going to prosecute Liz Cheney? And she's like, why aren't you asking me why crime is up in your state by 27%?
Right.
And he's like, you're not allowed to talk to me like that effectively. Right. He keeps talking over her and she's like, I don't know. I'm not answering your questions. Why don't you ask the right questions?
Well, and reminding him that he was censured for some of his remarks. That was actually
I just thought it was interesting because it's like, okay, you know what? Maybe all of the civility stuff, and the kind of the fake civility of the Senate hearing, could use a little barnacle scraping.
Right. And you saw the same dynamic with Hegseth in his hearing.
Yeah.
So, all right. So it's so maybe they shouldn't pack 6 in one day. Let's spread them out so we can actually watch these.
You can watch them and enjoy it like gladiatorial combat. Yeah.
She did not. She weaseled her way out of answering the questions about the work she did on sort of denying the last election. And that was the part where I really did think she came across as not reliable. And I wish she had better answers for those questions. She worked on those cases. She knew that
she didn't have better answers because there are no better answers than the answers she gave, which is she didn't want to say that she didn't do it. And she didn't want to say that Trump won in she did not want to say that Trump won in 2020, and she didn't want to say that Trump won in 2020. And so that's where, but in the end,
she saw a lot of things though.
Oh yes.
She saw things.
Boy, is she
but I mean, there's one thing, which is, this is a relatively new thing in American history, like the hearing, the public hearing. Often people did not actually have hearing. There were no hearings. They would just be voted up and down, or they couldn't get to Washington, because they were like riding on a horse from Kentucky when they were having their confirmation hearing. Somebody else would sit in for them or answer questions. This is, again, kind of a television era, media era thing. And, if these end up going badly for the Senate, you could have a kind of return to the, this is all crap. No one answers any serious questions. We're just going to go up and down. We'll just have a partisan vote.
The nominees go meet with the senators like they do individually, and then
and then there's just a vote because it's not going to serve anybody's purpose. Like the people who are like the grilling of Hegseth, for example, like Elizabeth Warren came out looking like a fool. It's not helpful to her,
right,
to look the way Hegseth just like
Well, he
knocked
looks
it out of the
downright
park.
henpecked. I'm sorry, but those memes that were going around of all those screaming lady
Mazie
senators,
Hirono
that was not a
yelling
good
at
look.
him, Warren yelling at him, Klobuchar yelling at
Gillibrand.
him. I know it was, yeah. Anyway, okay. So Trump's nominees are all apparently going to sail through. I mean, the weird thing is that there's a momentum effect, right? Because I know Tulsi Gabbard is still highly controversial, but if you have this thing where everybody is kind of the boulder is rolling down the hill, and the path of least resistance for 53 Republican senators is just to vote to confirm and then deal with the consequences afterwards. Maybe it'll end up 50-50 and Vance will break the tie in the Gabbard case. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really seen.
I mean, she's still doing her meetings. There's so there's a lot we'll learn before the hearing.
Yeah. By the way, John Ratcliffe, who is the CIA director, who also had his hearing yesterday, did something I thought was pretty interesting. Again, in the combat, he was like, I was the guy who said that the virus came from a lab. I'm one of these people that I was the director of national intelligence, and people were trying to suppress me from having my views put out on social media during the year 2020. And I was a senior official in the United States government. So don't be talking to me about what disinformation is.
By the way, that's another irony of the Biden speech, just to jump right back there. He's going to talk about the disinformation and misinformation on social media platforms. The guy who suppressed the story about him and his son. Give me a break.
Right.
Fair enough.
Anyway.
All right. Let's get to the main event. Hostage deal, ceasefire deal. Dan, you are as well-informed a person as exists in the United States about these things. One thing to be said, I don't think it's going to derail it, is that the Netanyahu's office last night issued a statement saying, we have not fully agreed to this deal. Hamas is playing games. After the announcement that the deal had been reached, Hamas is now playing games with the terms and details of the deal, and I am not yet ready to bring it to the Israeli full cabinet for a vote. Is that do I have that right?
It seems to me, and obviously it's a little foggy right now in terms of what's happening, but there seems to be two holdups. One is, so they agree on the number of prisoners, of Palestinian prisoners, that will be released from Israeli prisons, but Israel has a veto. So Hamas, the way this works, and the same way it worked last time too, in November of 23, is Hamas provides a list of the people it wants released, and as part of the deal, Israel has a veto, so we can look. So if like a Yehia Sinwar type, appears on the list, Israel can say, no way, that person isn't being released, and so Israel can exercise its veto. A, B, Israel wanted, as part of the deal, that some of the prisoners who are serving like multiple life sentences, and that if they're going to be released, they're released at the very end of the process, not at the beginning. And so, meaning they want to save those prisoners for perhaps at some point, if Israel, not in this phase, gets these young Israeli soldiers who are being held hostage out of Gaza. And my understanding is Hamas has been trying to front load some of those folks. So there's a dust up over which Palestinian prisoners are going to be released. By the way, this has happened in the past, so this doesn't surprise me. And I think these things get worked out. The second issue is, under the deal, and I don't know how granular you want to get at the deal, but it's a 42-day ceasefire. And then the hope is, I think it's unrealistic, but the hope is then they go to phase 2 of the deal. And Smotrich is arguing he wants a commitment.
Bezalel Smotrich. He is one of the two furthest right-wing members of the Bibi coalition, has 8 seats. If he were to pull out of the government would fall.
Yeah.
Maybe, although Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition, said that he would direct the opposition to approve the deal.
The point is, Ben Gvir is saying he's threatening to pull out in some form. So, but he can't do it alone. He needs Smotrich to do it with him. Smotrich is also the finance minister, I should say. So he's got a pretty big job in the government. If both of them pull out, then it poses a real threat to Netanyahu's government. Smotrich wants a commitment from Netanyahu that after phase one, Israel goes back to war, full stop. That there is no transitioning to quote unquote, phase two of the ceasefire. And now, anyway, so he wants that commitment, and so there's some last minute negotiations with Smotrich about how much Netanyahu commits to that. I should say in the deal that they reached in November of 23,
when 80 hostages were released over 7 days.
Right. The one of the holdups within the cabinet, similar to this situation, actually, one of the holdups inside the cabinet is many ministers did not believe that Israel would go back to the war after the 8 days. That by pausing for 8 days, Israel's basically stopping the war. And in the intra-cabinet debates, they made clear, Ron Dermer in particular, made clear to the
Ron
other
Dermer
ministers.
is the senior advisor, like Bibi's closest.
Yeah, he's his alter ego
advisor. Yeah,
and he's the Minister of Strategic Affairs. He argued we can and we will most likely go back to war after 8 days. Just because we pause for 8 days doesn't mean we can't resume. And so it's a similar dynamic now, although I think Smotrich is basically arguing 8 days is one thing, 42 is another. If we stop fighting for 42 days, the war is over. And I want to know the war is not over. And so, now the problem is if Bibi says that explicitly and that's public, that is going to put off some of the other parties in these negotiations. So anyways, these are these last minute hiccups. I would be surprised. I would really be surprised if we don't see the first 3 female hostages arriving in Israel sometime on Sunday. If anything, maybe it gets pushed to Monday. But I would be shocked if it doesn't happen. I mean, now the mood in Israel right now, it's just everyone I speak to, it's like everyone has now just assumed this deal is happening. Everyone has just assumed they're going to see 3 of these young women within days. And if suddenly the Israeli public is told this is not happening, it's one thing when hostage rounds of negotiations have fallen apart in the past, and they've been soul crushing. For instance, in the summer when they were pretty close or allegedly pretty close, and the deal fell apart, they had a list, I think, of 24 names, and the families of some of the people on that list, who people I'm in touch with, they knew. They were shown the list. They were showing their children's names in Arabic, meaning it was the list that Hamas had of these Israelis' kids' names in Arabic that they were going to be released. And so, and then for the deal to fall apart. And then, by the way, for some of those people who were on that list to be executed was the weekend at the end of the summer when the six hostages were executed. Is just so take what I just described. I think it would be even more intense and more destabilizing for Israeli society than what.
Look, you told me
because the idea because Israelis just assume now they're going to start seeing these hostages, and if they're told no, it's not happening. Yeah. Anyway.
You told me you got back. You were there in December. You got back. I think it was December, and you said
it was December. Yeah.
The mood in the country after this kind of like rallying of spirit after the pagers and the assassination of Mashal, the killing of Sinwar, the sort of triumphant
Hania, the killing of Hania. They haven't killed Mashal.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, Hania.
I'm sure Mr. Khalid Mashal would not appreciate you.
Yeah, I apologize. I apologize to him with a target on his forehead.
Right.
Yeah, Hania, and then of course the sort of the kind of destruction of Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut, and all of that all that had rallied the Israeli national spirit, but you had sensed in December that things were falling back into a kind of existential despair. And that this is part of it's not just Trump saying you better be done or there'll be hell to pay. That even on Bibi or the government's behalf, this feeling that it's 15 months and the agony is just too great
Yeah.
was very much present in your
So
estimation.
yeah, since October 7th, I've been to Israel. I don't know, 4 or 5 times, and I would say that trip was the hardest. Oddly, and I didn't expect it to be the case, because for all the reasons you're saying, because Israel had been achieving all this extraordinary success. But I think there were two things going on. One was this sense that even with all this success, there wasn't much Israel could do to get these hostages out. I mean, it's one thing when Israel's sort of losing or stuck, which it was kind of March, April, May. Then, I mean, it was brutal to say these hostages are there and we don't see how we get them out, but it was weirdly understandable because there's sort of like the war was stuck. But here was the sense that Israel can pull off this dazzling, the most impressive covert operation any Western country has conducted in like history. I mean, the pager attack, the walkie-talkie attack, they can send fighter jets to bomb the Houthis in Yemen. They can take out Iran's air defenses. They can do this. They can do that. But 40 miles from Tel Aviv, or whatever it is, 1 mile from southern Israel, there are Israeli citizens in dungeons now for, think about it in our sense, for 2 Thanksgivings. It's been 2 Thanksgivings since, like, more longer than that. So, and they can't do anything to get these people out. So even with all this success, Israel is still stuck with, close to 100 people out of a population, I should add, 9.5 million people. You're talking about, it would be the equivalent right now. Imagine 3,500 Americans. If you were just told 3,500 Americans are, held by Al-Qaeda, and for 2 Thanksgiving, basically a year and a half. And even with our dazzling military capabilities and success, and we can do anything, we can't do anything to get them out. And that's our new reality. We're just going to have to learn to live with that, because that was like settling in. Yeah. Like, how do you go on? How do Israelis go on with life? Like, do we just say, Ron Arad, who was this Israeli soldier who was taken hostage, a couple decades ago, it was never resolved. No one ever knew what happened to him. He just kind of disappeared. And I remember an Israeli producer of my podcast, Alon Benatar, who John, said to me, he says, it's like, are we just going to have 100 Ron Arads? Like, is Israel just going to have to learn, like, that's it. It just, we never deal with it. And that was settling in. And so that was hard, obviously. And then the other part was Israel's military is not wired to fight the war it is fighting. It is not. I mean, I know you know this firsthand from your nephew, John. Ben-Gurion's doctrine, his theory was always short wars and away games, like not fighting on its territory and its borders, and here Israel is now fighting the longest war in its history, and with no end in sight, by the way. I think this is Israel's new normal. On one front or another, it's going to be fighting a war. And the drain on Israeli manpower is, they're just not equipped for this. And so the burden is falling on
35-year-old men, 35-year-old, 40-year-old men.
Right. And so,
and by the way, right now, because of what the deal requires, there are these patrolling requirements in the deal, both in the south on the Philadelphia corridor, and then in basically the middle, bisecting from Kibbutz Be'eri to the water on the Netzarim corridor. Israeli reservists are going back into Gaza to station themselves during the ceasefire. And of course, should the ceasefire fall apart and action has to start again, either they're going to have to fight or they're going to be sitting ducks. Like, this is no joke.
Right.
This is a period of great peril for Israeli reservists who are going to be staffing this ceasefire proposal over the next 6 weeks.
And some of these people have been serving 200 and 300 days.
Yeah.
And these are people who are school teachers and construction workers and tech entrepreneurs and, people, as you said, like your nephew, like, they're young, but they're not 20. They're people who have families and lives and kids. And one day they're just plucked out of their world. And the stories, and this has been underreported, the wear and tear on marriages, on the mental health issues for the children of these parents. They don't, it's just, it's like a wrecking ball for Israeli society. And then when you add on top of it this sense that, and oh, by the way, all these Israelis are being held hostage and we have no real plan to get them out. And even when we're winning, we can't get them out. And that's just our new normal. It's hard to, you can't quantify. It's more art than science. You can't quantify the impact that has at a time that Israel is still asking all these people to leave their jobs and leave their families and go fight. And I'll tell you, I won't mention their name, but a family I'm in touch with some of these hostage families. So one of them has a loved one or had a loved one in Gaza, and they have another family member who's just been called up to start their army service, a sibling of and this sibling is going in. The sibling is joining the army after the other sibling is sitting there in Gaza. And it's like, and the family said, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to do it. Right? We'll move out of Israel for a couple of years. We understand. This is like, and the kid is like, no, I want to go. I'm going to go. And so, no, that's great. And that's a testament to Israel. I don't know how long. I think there's a sense in Israel, certainly among the leadership, there's got to be a little give here. There's got to be a little bit of a break. The power of seeing some hostages come back, even if it's a bad deal, which it is, but it doesn't mean it's a deal Israel shouldn't do. And I think the power of seeing Israelis sending the message, Israel sending the message that we will move heaven and earth, we will do everything we have to do to get, hostages out is important. And my only argument on the deal is, no matter when Israel does this, it's full of problems, right? But I think Israel's definitely taking risk by doing this deal. But if you don't take risk now, when do you take it? Israel is in the strongest position it's been in, geopolitically, militarily, since I think after the 6 Day War. I can't think of another period where Israel's been in a better position. It's the dominant military and intelligence and economic power in the Middle East today. It wasn't that case 6 months ago. If it is not going to take some risk now to get hostages out, they're basically saying to the Israeli public, we have no plan to get these hostages out. And
the tragedy, of course, is that the 6 hostages who were killed in the tunnels, including Hirsch Goldberg Poland, the most famous of certainly of the American the American Israeli hostages. What punched the heart out of the hopes, out of certain hopes, is that they were on the verge of being rescued. And
well, that's who I was. Yeah,
they were executed, so that the Israeli sense of itself, which is that we perform miracles. Like, the miracles have been performed technologically now in Iran, in Beirut, with the pagers. But the miracles before was the miracle of Entebbe, right? That was
right.
sort of like, that was Israelis' great foundational miracle, that they pulled off this insane rescue of 183 or however many people it was in the airport in Entebbe from the hijacking. And Israel came face to face with an effort to do something pretty similar, with this tragic consequence that I gather probably put paid to the idea that what they should really be doing is looking in the tunnels to rescue the hostages, because if they did that, they were putting the hostages at risk, and with the risk wasn't worth the reward.
Right. Yeah.
So that was taken away from them.
Exactly.
Which was right.
No,
when
exactly.
They win, and they win in Rafah, and they're really dominating everything, they'll just go down in there and they'll find them.
Right.
And they'll bring them back up, and they'll bring them home.
Right. And the Hamas operatives guarding these hostages have been told, if you hear anything, if anything gets close, just execute. So they're in the mode of killing them. Right. So that's been taken away from them. And the challenge here is, Israel's been engaged in negotiations throughout its history with numerous countries. I hate to use the term a win-win negotiation, but there usually is more or less a win-win. When Menachem Begin was negotiating with Anwar Sadat, it was basically a win-win. When, obviously, Israel and the U.S. were negotiating with the Abraham Accords countries, it was basically a win-win. This negotiation with Hamas is not like any of those negotiations. It is a zero-sum game. Israel wants its hostages back, and it wants Hamas gone forever. Hamas wants to figure out a way to hang on, cling on, and stay in power in Gaza. That's what they're both doing. So they're both. So
no one can
Hamas
win.
isn't
Only one side in the end can win.
right. So Israel has to try to get its hostages back. The only way it can get its hostages back is to actually, this is weird to say this, but they have to convince Hamas, even though they don't want this to be true, Israel has to convince Hamas that by giving up some hostages, Hamas has some narrow path to staying into power. Because but for that, why would Hamas give up the hostages? It's all about their own survival in Gaza.
Okay, so
And-
can we
but this
talk
is
about
my-
the deal? Because go ahead,
Yeah,
Em, I'm
I have a
sorry.
question on this. There's also the issue here. It's tied into this, which is, so how does Bibi finesse his right flank on this issue of resuming the war? Hamas is not going to overtly agree to a deal that says, yes, after we release some hostages, you can come back at us.
Right. I think what'll probably happen is if everything goes according to plan, according to how, the Israeli government imagines it, is Israel. It's sort of similar to what happened in November, right? So in November of 23 is they do the first phase, they get some hostages out, which are the most vulnerable hostages. You're talking about women, maybe some children, elderly people, probably one or two of the 3 Americans that we know are alive. They'll get them out, and then Hamas will do something to make it easy for Israel to justify going back in.
Right, that's
And-
what happened. People probably don't remember this, but I was actually in Israel during the pause in
Yeah.
November of 23, and people were coming out every day, and then rockets were fired from Hamas territory. That ended the pause, and Israel's like, okay, that's it, and the war had to restart. They were playing games during that week. They were like, we're going to release so and so, and then they didn't, and then they released some people, and then finally, basically, Hamas could not restrain itself any longer and went back, tested the pause by firing rockets, and then Bibi's like, okay, we're done. We're going back to war. This is the thing that you mentioned here, which is, and this gets to the terms of the deal I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
It's very complicated, and it's not entirely clear the sequence here. There are these 3 stages. I want to go into the 3 stages, but so the first stage is this 6-week, 42-day stage, followed by a.
Well, let me say
Okay.
the Nadav Ayal, who was on my podcast, we recorded yesterday, who he's been deep in the agreement. I mean, the terms of the agreement. I mean, he basically said, trying to decipher what's going to happen in phase 2 and phase 3. He's like, good luck. He's
as a friend of mine said, there isn't going to be a phase 2 or a phase 3. Ultimately,
that was my point.
If all the hostages come out, and it's 6, if the hostages come out,
if the 33 come out,
the 33 come out, but if the 33 come out, and then it's 42 days in, and Hamas is like, nah, we're not going to do any more. Then it's like the war starts again. The war starts again. There will be no further hostage releases.
Maybe not,
or maybe not. Right. So, but
after I'll tell you. I mean, I don't mean to. This is after November of 23. I remember some hostage families saying to me, this is the last deal Israel's ever going to do, and it was like devastating for them.
Yeah.
And here we are. I'm not like, trust me, for the families whose loved ones were executed at the end of the summer of 24, for them that argument was right. For those people, they'll never get a hostage deal. But
a very interesting statement was released yesterday by Rachel Goldberg Poland and John Poland, whose son Hirsch, right, was killed in that, was executed in that rescue attempt. And they said, and this is where it gets very they were being very apolitical.
Mm-hmm.
This deal, as Biden said last night in his speech, is fundamentally in contour the deal that was proposed in May of 24 by the Biden administration. And there's this one jagged line in their statement about how we're happy other people are going to see it. So, we need all the hostages home. And, if this deal had gone through in May of 2024, basically our son would not be dead. And this is where I think Bibi,
John, his
yeah,
name was on the
was
list
on the list. That's right.
because even though Hirsch was close to military age and was male, so under normal circumstances he would not be released early, because he had suffered such a brutal injury on October 7th, and he was become an amputee, and he was now in the list. He was on the list for the first phase.
Right.
So trust me,
but
is
I bring
brutal.
this up. I bring this up only to say that there is a deep political danger as this flows over the Israeli public, that if this was really the same deal, now granted, as you say, Dan, Israel was not in the military position that it's in now, and it could not really have, and by the way, it's not that Israel didn't agree to the deal in May or the reassertion of the deal in September. According to Tony Blinken, Hamas scuttled every deal.
And
It's
Brett
not that
McGurk,
Israel
they all said
scuttled
this.
it.
By the way, Brett McGurk,
Yeah.
he was saying it last summer. He's like, we don't have a Bibi problem. We have a Hamas problem.
Right. But they're standing there saying that if this is the same deal as in May, and we could have come to it in May, the suffering that these people have undergone over the last 7 months could have been avoided. Now, you may think that's irrational. You can blame Hamas, whatever. But that's one of the reasons we talk about it being a bad deal. But it's not just that. It's that what if this suffering, and not just their suffering, but the suffering of the families, was somehow can be laid at the door of the government in an effective political way. I don't know. That's why this is a very weird period of time. Also,
so the
because
only thing I would say is, I got into it a little bit with Nadav on our podcast, because he basically said the framework of this deal is the same as the summer deal, as the original Biden Netanyahu deal, and so basically we're finally getting that deal. Except, as to your point, for some of these families, it's too late. The framework is the same, but some of the details are different, and those details matter, in my view. One of which was the deal from the spring and summer. Hamas was insisting that the war be over in phase one. Like the Israeli government negotiated hard. We are not declaring the war over. And that, I think, is extremely important. A. B, Hamas said it couldn't really figure out which hostages they had, which ones were dead, which ones were alive. So they gave no commitment to Israel in that, and to the mediators back then, that they were really going to produce many live Israelis. There was, and I know this is a loaded subject, and I want to, the issue of whether or not Israel should stay in the Philadelphia corridor, which is this important strategic area at the Gaza-Egyptian border. Israel was going to have to leave the Philadelphia corridor entirely. Israel stays in the Philadelphia corridor under this deal, at least through the first phase, not in the same way it's been in it, but it still maintains some presence. So anyways, I can go on and on. My only point is there are meaningful differences in this deal relative to...
And then you ultimately have the ultimate meaningful difference, of course, is the change in administration.
Can I ask about that, actually? Because I'm very curious to hear Dan's prediction. Monday we have an inaugural address by Trump. Do you think first he's going to mention the deal and claim he saw it through and it's a win-win for him, at least, as he loves to do with any sort of deal making? Right. Is he just not going to talk about it? But given our domestic politics right now, both Biden and Trump wanted to claim a sort of victory this week.
Yeah.
Do you see that as politically useful for either one of them long term? Because we see domestically the issue of Israel and Gaza continues to have its same sort of violent overtones. All the student protesters didn't see this as any sort of end to what their long-term campaign is. So how do you see this shaping both the near term and the longer term domestic?
I have no idea if Trump will mention it in his inaugural, but it almost doesn't matter because he's just going to talk about it. He posted something about it yesterday. He's just going to be talking about it nonstop. I think there's a general sense that, and this is the view, I think, for people who are following it over here, and it's also the view of the hostage families, by the way. The hostage families believe what I'm about to say. This would not have happened without Trump's intervention. They really believe that. And some of these hostage families, under normal circumstances, most of them are not people who would be like naturally sympathetic to Donald Trump. And in fact, these are all people who over the last 15 months had spent a lot of time with Biden and Blinken and McGurk and Sullivan, and they'd gotten to know them, and they all had their cell numbers, and they felt very close to the Biden team. And yet many of them told me they thought the Biden team were completely ineffective, as one family put it to me. Blinken and Joe Biden are the nicest guys. They cry with me, they hug me, they're empathetic, and yet the enemies were running circles around them in the Middle East. They were completely ineffective, and they were like welcoming Trump to just kind of shake things up. If nothing else, the unpredictability of Trump being injected into the region, they believed was the only way to kind of unlock this process that had been stuck. So I think, and I think people over here, for those who are following it, this is much more viewed as as Trump's win than Biden's win. But I don't think it's going to change much of anything in terms of the toxic debate about Israel over here. I just think I think that the debate about Israel and Gaza and Hamas it's so not about what's really going on. It's about something else. And so the developments don't even matter, regardless of
by the
what
way, so we're pushing hard on time here because Dan has to go. I just wanted to talk about what we're hearing from the Trump people about phase 2 or about the end of phase 1 or whatever, which is that we are hearing, they're telling you, I'm hearing secondhand all that this thing about how the war is not, this deal does not feature a permanent ceasefire or an end to the war. And Israel has the right, therefore, implicitly, to restart its hostilities should something happen. But this is where I think it gets interesting, because Mike Waltz, the incoming National Security Advisor, said, we have agreed, or we believe Israel has the right to go back in, assuming Hamas deserves it. Essentially saying Israel doesn't have the right to go back in unilaterally, in our view. We'd like to say, you know what, we're sick of this, we're going back in. As I think you said was true in November of 2023, there would need to be a casus belli on the part of Hamas to give the Trump administration the cover to say, we're with Israel all the way here. If Israel unilaterally breaks the ceasefire, Trump might get angry. Trump might say, this was my ceasefire, this is my triumph, and I'm sorry, I don't, Steve Witkoff is coming back to yell at Bibi again. I don't know. I mean, that's I think a weird set of circumstances. Although, again, what did Pete Hegseth say? Pete Hegseth said, I want every single member of Hamas dead.
And I had Mike Waltz on my podcast, John. He said he said the same thing. Every member of Hamas should be killed. Yeah. And I said to him, well, Hamas thinks they're going to stay in power. So, so I don't know, how they.
I'm sorry. Yeah. On this point, it's very confusing because I texted the group yesterday. I saw Mike Waltz say Hamas is not going to be a military force, and they're not going to be in government. So what are they going to survive as?
Yeah. So my answer was an Amway distributor. Yes, right. I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah, I would have said a UN-funded NGO.
Yeah, I mean, that is the problem, right? Is that if the policy isn't that Hamas needs to be, literally destroyed, which they're saying is saying they would like, but is not specifically the policy as laid out obviously it's not. Hamas wouldn't agree to such a policy. It has seemingly broken through to not demanding that Israel say the war is over. But that's why I say the end of phase one is a very, very tricky thing. But we have 6 weeks to get to the end of phase one. And here's the question that I have for you, because I am so confused. We keep hearing that the story is 3 people are going to come out on Sunday, and then 4 people are going to come out
7 days later. Yeah.
7 days later. And then over the course of those 6 weeks, depending on the release of Palestinian prisoners, the remaining, what is that, 28 or 27 or something like that will come out, including bodies.
Yeah. So here's
so
how
that
it
it may be 23 alive and 10 dead.
Right. So
over 42 days. I don't know how is it gonna feel triumph? Is it gonna feel good to the Israelis to know that as this is going on, there are still 65 people in there?
No, of course not.
Right. Okay. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's even worse than that, John. Those people are going to wonder, is this the last deal? It's sort of what I was saying about some thought about November. Is this the last deal that is ever going to happen? Like, there's no way. Everyone had to be dragged kicking and screaming to get this deal done. Do we really think there's going to be another deal done? So this is what, I mean, I got to tell you, why I can't think of a single society that is pushed to so many breaking points than Israel, right? You just think how excruciating it is. So imagine, I don't want to get into the details because it's so upsetting and it's a lot of dirty laundry that shouldn't be aired, but just imagine the jockeying, understandable jockeying going on within the hostage movement to figure out how to get your loved one added to the first phase list.
Yeah.
So just think about that. And obviously they agreed on 33. So if one person gets added, some person gets removed.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
It's just unspeakable.
And then I know some families who know that their loved one is dead and they want the body back, and they're busy out there trying to argue and negotiate for their dead child's body to be returned. And other people in Israel are like, really? We're going to expend capital to, like, let's get the living ones out first. But obviously, for some of these families, they're like, we want closure. We want to bury our and now why these next few weeks are going to be so brutal is they're not releasing, my understanding, the dead bodies that are going to be part of this deal till the very end, to like the 5th or 6th week. So Israelis are going to be watching week to week. They know if their loved one is on the list, but if they don't know if week after week time is passing and their loved one isn't being released in those early weeks, they're living in fear of, oh my God, is mine
the worst news? Yeah. And by the way, the other thing that people aren't even talking about, and again, I know you got to go.
Fine for a couple more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so there are soldiers that are in captivity. They are not on this list, right? They're soldiers who were essentially
male soldiers,
POWs.
Yeah. Female soldiers, I think, are gonna come out. Yeah.
So they're not on this list at all, and the families there, I believe, if you really listen, if you're like listening with Straussian ears, you are getting the sense, given what's in the details of phase 2 and phase 3, that the families of the soldiers who are among those captive are slowly going to have to come to grips with the fact that it is more likely than not that they will never see them again. Right. And we're not even talking about them because they exist in a slightly different legal moral realm. They're actually, because they have been taken in war, they're, weirdly enough, even though you're talking about Hamas, which is not a state, no dictator, but they're still supposed to have certain kinds of Geneva Convention rights or an understanding, particularly if you're trading prisoners for soldiers, prisoners for other people. And I don't think people have come to reckon with that either, because I think,
and that's why some of those families of the male soldiers have been, some of them, not all of them, to be fair, but some of them have argued, we can't agree to this phased deal. It's got to be one deal, like everyone gets released in one. There's one package here because they argue if it's easy, it's quote unquote easy for Hamas to justify releasing women, children, and elderly people, or people who've been wounded or who are sick, unless our loved one, our son, who's 25, is attached to them. Who the hell knows when he's going to get out? So don't go cut your own deal.
Yeah.
And obviously, and then others argue, there's no quote unquote cutting our own deal. We're trying to get out whoever we can get out, and we'll get them out. We can get them out. And I mean, so these are, it's just like I said earlier.
Yeah.
It's like you can't imagine another. Again, it's the scale. By the way, I'll tell you a story. Someone I know who worked on the hostage negotiation team told me in Israel that after October 7th, the Biden team said, we have a whole department focused on hostage negotiations. It's at the U.S. State Department. They're at your disposal. Coordinate, get advice. Work with them. They're there to help you. And the Israeli team thought, oh, great. They thought they were dealing with like the parent in the relationship. Like they're the experiences. The U.S. They have big infrastructure, resources. They're going to help us. And at some point, the U.S. hostage team said, we've never seen anything like this. Like we can't help you. Meaning you are now more experienced in this than we are, because the U.S. deals with Brittany Griner and deals with these one. This is to have, at the time it was 250, but now close to 100. To have that many hostages being held by one organization, and to have, they said they've never had women and children. They've never had children. The idea that children, the U.S. said, this is out of our depth. It's out of our experience. So I just keep coming back to like these decisions and how you, again, imagine the U.S., 3,500 Americans being held hostage, women, children, elderly people, like what we would be doing. Imagine what would be going on here. It's just, it's like, it's brutal.
So I think, we have been on this spot. We have been speaking very negatively about this deal since the terms came out to 48 hours ago or whenever it was. And I do want to say that given the fact that it is now in place, that the deal is the deal, assuming that it doesn't fall apart in the next 24 hours because of Hamas hijinks or whatever. That I don't want to belittle or act as though I have any wisdom, or that any of us who are disheartened by the deal have any wisdom to offer Israelis about how there was a better path. I mean, if you're focused on the hostages, if the focus is, I'm sorry, war is hell, life is awful. Israel cannot be blackmailed by terrorists with hostages. It's going to have to go ahead and do what it does, and we'll see what the end results are. But clearly that's not how Israel can react to this. And so under the circumstances, the only thing really to do is hope that this goes well. I mean, and hope that the fear of Trump, whatever that is, doesn't abate. The one danger of Trump taking victory laps is that it will have the negative consequence of giving Hamas some sense that it has a whip hand here of denying Trump this win that it wanted, if it does X, Y, and Z. And so they may have America over a barrel. That's not great, but I don't really question the Israeli government's decision, whatever the cabinet decides. I don't feel like we're in a moral place to do that. And if the government doesn't fall, that means that it will be the consensus view of Israel that this deal is better than not having the deal. And Israel is everyone in Israel are the people who are going to have to deal with the consequences, not me, or not, geopolitically, that may be a slightly different story, but that's where things are.
Yeah.
So hostile though I may be to the deal as a strategic construct.
Yeah, analytically,
but emotionally you cannot question.
Yeah, so, I know you're not a huge fan of Nadav, but he did say on my podcast yesterday, he said, and this is the most suffering in the worst conditions Jews have lived under in captivity since the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I think because Jews have had a lot of suffering, and I'm thinking,
And Israelis have had a lot of suffering.
right.
I mean, right now there's this movie out about September 5th about the hostage taking at the Munich Olympics. That was 11 athletes. One of them was It was sexually mutilated before he was killed. And, but that was 48 hours or 24 hours. Like, it wasn't 470 days.
Right.
And, we know for Gilad Shalit was held in captivity for 5 years. And I don't know if you had this experience, Dan, but I met Gilad Shalit 6 months after he came out. And it was a very distressing experience. He was I mean, I don't know where he is now. It's 15 years later, but he was a shell of a person. Like, he was not, he was somebody who looked like he had come through the concentration camps. I mean, it was not very different from that. And so, God knows what Israel is going to see over the next 6 weeks.
And learn about
the stories that they're going to tell. So anyway, so we can only hope. I mean, now the deal is in place, and hope is a perfectly acceptable strategy that a turn has been taken for the better for them and for Israel's spirit, and that all that needs to happen will happen. So, Dan Senor, thank you.
Thank you guys
so much for your wisdom and knowledge and slight, green shoots of something. I don't know.
Which must be jarring to the commentary.
Very jarring. The crushing.
It's very anti, crushing.
Very anti our brand. But you did use Abe's phrase. You did say it's worse than that, and Abe didn't have to.
Oh yeah, it's worse than that. Exactly.
It's worse than that. Yeah.
All right. As long as I didn't provide any permission structures. All right. Take care.
Okay. So for Christine and Abe, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.